Hey everybody, so I'm Ryan. I'm a PhD student at Ontario Tech University in Nick Godelfa's One Lab. This is going to be a quick tutorial on how we worked through and did some of the analysis for our inverse dynamics experiment using an upper body forces and bringing them through to get joint moments and angles output. And I'll explain the experiment in a little bit, but you can take a look at this, watch this almost the whole way through so you get a good idea of your workflow. I always like to sort of plan everything and at every step. It'll give you a good idea, and I mentioned some errors that I wish we had changed throughout the process. So if you watch the thing the whole way through, it might give you a better idea of how to set up your experiment. Also, if you're having any sort of problems, I reached out to C-Motion a couple of times throughout this, and they were fantastic, even not necessarily pointing out issues that I had that were very, very dumb questions. So they're fantastic with their support. If you have any problems, feel free to reach out to them or hit me up on ResearchGate. I could probably point you in the right direction. Again, I'm by no means an expert, but I figured a little video demo was a little more than was available on YouTube at this point in time. So hopefully this helps you a little bit. Thanks. Okay, this is going to be a brief demonstration on how to, or what my workflow was going through V3D, taking raw force data, converting that, pipelining it into Visual3D, building a model that can support inverse dynamics that according to ISB conventions, then building another, applying the forces to that model, building a pipeline to export those forces, and then a little bit of just how I worked with those forces for the MAS study that we're doing. So briefly to describe the data and how we got it, essentially the person was exerting at multiple different locations using a sort of handle on the wall, which was instrumented with a force transducer. So they would be exerting at three different positions: low umbilicus, in line with the belly button, at shoulder height, and then overhead. They were doing this with both their right and their left hand, and then they were also doing 6 directions at each one of those positions. So up, down, push, pull, left, right. And so I have here in my data folder, I'll open that up. I have that coded here, and I'll leave all these folders in the comments of the video, and I'll leave those permalinked, and any code I'll leave linked to my GitHub. But here I have, this is our 4th participant here. We're using some of their data. I have the trial numbers associated, and those will come in handy later. And you can see that we have coded our location, 0 for umbilicus, 1 for shoulder, and 2 for overhead here, between our right and left hand, 1 being left hand. And then, our direction, up, down, push, pull, left, right. And that's coded here as well. So we'll need this data sheet later when I bring it into MATLAB to make sure that all my data makes sense. But a lot of this is going to be going through Visual3D in the process to actually get the data in appropriately. So for now, we can get rid of that. And all right, what I will do first is we'll go through how to convert the data into a usable format, because if I just straight up try and bring this data into Visual3D, it's not going to work. So knowing this up front is a nice luxury that you don't go through building your model and then have to bring all this data in and then try to apply it, bang your head against the wall like I did a bunch of times, and then figure out that, oh, you actually have to do something special to it first. So you can download this program called Convert3D, and you can see it has a little pipelining program which takes text files or different C3D files and converts them to a Visual3D properly formatted text file. So what this does is you add the files. So I'm going to add our raw files to this, and what I'm going to do is I'm always going to do a couple files, and then I'll art attack it or cooking show it, and then present the sort of finished product with a bunch of trials, and we'll go through enough that should make sense. But what I'm going to do here is, if my mouse would work, go into this demo folder. Okay, so we're gonna go, into force data, You can see here that it's looking for text files and it's not finding any. That's because our data wasn't exported in the form of a tab delimited or comma delimited text file. We collected our signals and time synced them and did a little bit of filtering through a acquisition program, LabVIEW, so a little custom program in LabVIEW, and that exported as a DAT file. So when I change that to all files down there, you can see that all our DAT files come up. So to save yourself some time, here's a tip. You don't want to convert all your files if you have sort of extraneous data files that you aren't going to need down the line. Make sure to not go in and convert them all. So the easiest way that you can do that is I'm going to bring up, is this our importing? There we go. Oh, it doesn't like it to sit side by side like that. I'll do it on my other monitor here. Oh, that should be fine. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through and choose trial by trial, making sure that we don't choose any additional ones. I guess I'm going to have to do it on my other monitor. So we're choosing 48, 49, 52, 50, 47, 51, 41, 44, 43, 46, not 11, we want 12, 13, 17, 16, 14, 10, 4, 6, 3, 2, 7, 9, 2, 7, 9, 34, 32, 36, 36, 40, 38, 39, 40, 38, 39, and 31, 21, 20, 31, 21, 20, 22, 23, 25, 22, 23, and 25. Okay, so now that we've got all those in, this will typically be blank for you here. So I'll remove this profile and we'll build a new one from scratch. So what the profile does is it goes in and looks at the data and then applies a certain amount of changes, like a little sort of basic code to change that file. The first thing I'm going to want to do though, before I make my profile, is get myself started in sort of my workflow. So I'm going to make sure to change this. I basically want to export it with very similar names. I just want to sort of copy this naming format, but it's going to be a TXT. And basically what that's going to do for me is it's going to retain all my valuable information that we had from this this trial sheet here that tells me not only the trial number, the location, the hand, and direction. So if I go back, I can quickly reference that and make sure that I had the right data. Also, keeping this file name will help you when you're importing into LabVIEW. Into Visual3D, because I'll describe later, there's a very specific set of sequences you need to do. So I'm going to go and copy just what the first one is, 001, and it is trial 48. And we're going to leave it as text. And then I'm going to change this folder here into this new one, and I'm just going to drop everything into this big folder so that's not referencing the individual sort of raw data from these other folders after a little bit. It'll be easier in MATLAB. Okay, so I've got that naming convention set up. I've got where it's going to export set up. You can see that if I click this, it's not really applying anything. It says finished. So if we go to our folder, there's a text file here, but it didn't do anything. So I'm going to make sure to delete that. I believe it does overwrite, so you gotta be careful with that. But what we're going to do first is we're going to add a profile. So what you're going to do is, I'm going to name this profile manual arm strength study, and you need to know something about your data, your raw data, when investigating it. So what we're going to do, when converting it. So first I'm going to open our force data here. I'm just going to open this trial. We'll open it with Excel. Okay, so this is our force data. So what we have embedded is our trial numbers, and some of our position data that I talked about is in the file name. Basically what we did was the first 50 rows are a buffer because we wanted to filter this data a little bit as we exported it. So in order to create that moving average and not have it interfere with the data and bleed into the first couple points, we buffered it with 50 rows of zeros. I believe this is all sampled at 100 Hertz. And then we have an additional one column off to the left, which is no data, and that what that corresponds to is just allowing for our naming conventions. So we have 5 channels. Our first channel is channel 1, 2, 3, being our X, Y, Z of the force transducer. And the orientation, I guess, doesn't necessarily matter for this analysis. I can describe it in a little bit. The fourth channel is then the resultant. So the main direction, the way we had coded it was if it was an up trial, what that would do is obviously if it was oriented in such a way that up was actually a negative X, let's say, it would be creating a negative force. This is the absolute of that main direction. So if it's an up trial, this will give the absolute of up. If this is a down trial, this will give the absolute of down from whichever one of these channels that's occurring, or like left, right, or push pull. So this will just take the absolute of the main direction for that trial. And then the final channel 5 is the resultant channel. So when we're actually importing this, we only really care about the first 3 channels. I'm going to convert all 5, but when we import into Visual3D, you're going to see that we're only going to use these 3. Again, just sort of preserving your data and maybe helping you next steps. I'm going to convert this data just in case if you ever want to then use it in a different way. Now you don't have to go back and convert it again. You can just convert it the one time. Okay, so that being said, we can come back to our convert 3D, and I said that that first row is a buffer of zeros, so we don't necessarily care about that. So we're going to tell it to ignore, or sorry, the first column. We're going to ignore that first column, and we are also going to ignore the first 50 rows just to get to our data. It's tab delimited data. Excel knew that when I opened it. We're going to leave the decimal as a period, and then we are going to tell it the rate at which it was sampled, which is 100 Hertz. So we're going to insert a couple columns here. We're going to insert 5 columns for each one of those real data columns that we had. And then in here, I'm just going to call these channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, channel 4, and channel 5. You could name these more appropriately to the directions that they are. I believe, I'll try this quickly, I believe I have this in my notepad. I wrote this down, the orientation. Okay, so this is the orientation of the transducer. So this was the handle right here. So if the person's hand was placed there, a upwards exertion was a negative X, or a downwards was a positive X. A leftwards exertion was a positive Z, a rightwards was negative Z, and then a pull was a positive Y, and a push was a negative Y. So channel 1, 2, 3. So then we have our implications for our directions that way. But again, we'll come back to this at a later date when we bring it into Visual3D. So right there, what we can do is it's going to scale it by a factor of 1, bring it in, and it's basically going to be stripping this data, which is analog, and then bringing it in. Now, I was clearly an idiot, and I emailed CMotion to say I had figuring it out and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong, and I'd put owner here as like Ryan. I use a lot of clinical instrumentation, and it asks for sort of the experimenter or clinician, and yeah, the owner here is actually going to be the corresponding parent file in Visual3D, which we haven't created our C3D workspace or Visual3D workspace yet. So what I'm going to do is go in to our kinematics data and pull. I know that our first trial that we're converting is 48, and I'm going to copy that paste that in here, and add an asterisk before it so it doesn't need the exact file path. Because what owner means here is the exact file path that it will be looking for. So what we're going to do is when we export everything, we're going to have it in the same actual folder as all of this data. So once we do that, it'll all be in the same one. So we can just use the asterisk. We don't need different file paths all over the place. Because every channel is going to be in the same one, they're not in different folders, we're going to then copy and paste that into each one of these channels. Okay, so that should be good. We can then click OK. Click on this. As long as you have one of these selected, you then move it over and hit convert. It's going to ask me to overwrite because I converted that one before. We're going to hit convert. Again, making sure our naming conventions here are all right, and then we'll double check that that looks pretty good when we open it here. So now what you can see here is we have our channels labeled frame numbers, our analog channels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then our channels, our time, and then their parent associated Visual3D file or C3D file when we're going to bring it into Visual3D. And then we have all the data here. So that should work great for us. And yeah, that's that first step in converting. It's a little tedious, but what we're going to do then from then on is click onto the next one. Make sure we change our naming conventions there. And then going in here, we've set it up so everything was subject, then the date, then this unique identifier, and then the trial number. If you have it differently, you might need to go back and copy and paste it every time, but because I know the only thing changing here is the trial number, I can then copy and paste the trial number, put that new one over, click convert, and then do the same thing going on to the next one. So we'll do a couple here just so you can sort of see how my workflow was. And from there, making sure from time to time that you've got everything correct. Change that to 52. If you don't, this is where it is really important. If you don't have these parent or these owners labeled correctly, and you try and bring it into Visual3D under a different C3D file, so you're bringing in a let's say I'm trying to bring in the data file for 52, and in Visual3D I had actually clicked 49, it will crash. And let's say I wanted to bring in the text file for 52, but in the conversion process, like all the data is from 52, but in the conversion process I messed up one of these and it says 50, it'll crash. And now you're going back through your data to double check it all to make sure. So when in doubt, really just go back and copy and paste it all again, flip it over, and then convert it, and that should be totally good. Yeah, so that's the conversion process. I'm gonna again finish all these, and then we'll come back into how to bring it into Visual3D and how to build your model. Okay, so now that I've got all the files converted here, we can close off our Convert 3D. And what I'm going to do is now build our model. The easiest way, like I said, is once we have all our force data there, I'm going to take our kinematics data and just copy and paste it right into that same folder that we were in. It looks kind of messy, but to have everything within the same folder, that way you're not changing directories a bunch of times. And so now what we've got is we've got our anthropometrics, our static trial here, all our C3D trials, and then all our text files there. And then we've got our MATLAB code, which we'll use later. Okay, so the way I'm going to build this model is pretty standard in terms of the limbs. We're using the Wu et al. ISB standards for orientation of our axis systems and modeling of each joint. So really, I'm going to just go through this sort of step by step. The way you're going to want to start this is to open up Visual3D not from any of these files. Mine is a evaluation license and it doesn't like me very much. But once that opens up, we can then get started. So obviously the first thing we're going to do is we are going to save this workspace just so we can always then hit save and go back and forth and sorry, not be overwriting. So we're going to save this as our subject 4 workspace. So under model, we're going to create a model from this hybrid C3D file. We have our static trial here, which is our person in anatomical position, which we clipped as a single frame. You can see it's a very small file size. So we went into first principles. We collected this data via OptiTrack, so an active marker system, and with digitized points around the rigid bodies. And then so we just clipped out a single static trial of their anatomical position. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring that in. So rotating around, again, you should probably be fairly well oriented with Visual3D if you're going to be attempting this. But I can see here how I've got the person set up. So this is their thorax marker, which I know was on their back. Then this would be their right arm and hand, left arm and hand. And then we have some markers here. So we had both acromions, so left and right. Then we also had a digitized point at the center of the rigid body. And then that sort of gave us a proxy T8. We didn't actually palpate to get T8, but kind of gave us like a little proxy for it. And then we have a suprasternal notch. Doesn't want to click there. Suprasternal notch and xiphoid digitized as well. On the arms, we obviously have some redundancy here, so we have the upper arm segment consists of acromion, medial and lateral epicondyles. The forearm consists of medial and lateral epicondyles, then radial and ulnar styloid, and then the hand segments consist of radial and ulnar styloid, base of the second, base of the fifth metacarpal, and that's on both sides. So what I like to do is sort of just get started. We can start making our arm segments first and then go to our thorax. But in order to make our arm segments first, what we're going to have to do is localize some points. So I'm just going to pause for a second to let you get oriented there, and then we're going to start making some landmarks. Okay, so to start off building our model, a couple of things we're going to need because we didn't necessarily digitize them or because you want to approximate them anyways. So the first is going to be, we're going to approximate C7. Personally, if I had to go back and do this again, I would straight up digitize C7, T8, the acromions, xiphoid, and suprasternal notch. We don't have T8 or C7 digitized for this project. We didn't exactly know that we were going to be building the thorax model this way. So it's not the end of the world. You can generally approximate stuff differently. So under the model, under the landmarks tab and landmarks, we're going to add a new landmark. We're going to name it C7. We're going to use the lab coordinate system, so you can see that there's negative Z there, and we are going to, positive Z, we are going to put it 10 centimeters up from our midpoint of our thorax rigid body there. And I will slide this more into the middle so you can see that pop up when I hit apply. Oh. It was not, see how it popped up from the lab coordinate system. I didn't determine the reference starting point, and I want that as the middle of that rigid body. So you can always sort of watch it and see where that point pops up, and then go back, click on the point, it will light up, and then you can work on looking at where it moved to. And obviously you should have some context around how you can build your model and how it should look. So if your C7 appears at the bottom of the frame, that's obviously not correct, and then you can look at where you went wrong there. So the next two, I'm going to make our right shoulder. I'm going to use a starting point of our right acromion from our thorax segment. I'm going to then offset it according to the lab segment 5 centimeters below the right acromion. And that's a pretty standard way to approximate the joint center for the right shoulder, or both shoulders. So when I click OK, you can now see that it's approximated just below the acromion there. Going to then go back, do the same thing for the left, using our digitized points for our left acromion. Again, this is marked according to the thorax segment. We also have a left acromion for the arm segments. Those just move a little bit more, and due to that, there might be some blackout from the cameras. Shoulders are obviously a pretty important joint for our analysis later on. We want to avoid as much blackout as possible, and if the arm blacks out, I'll show you a way around that that we can work out later. But again, I'm going to drop one just about 5 centimeters below. Notice again that I'm not checking off that it's a calibration only landmark. So I'm going to leave that, and then it's not offset by any percentage there. Okay, so we're going to hit apply and then come back to our landmarks. Okay, so a couple more segments that we are going to need is this sort of mock transducer segment, because when we import the files, we're going to need to apply them to a certain segment, and we don't want to apply them directly to one segment because we're switching between right and left hands. So in order to do this, we're going to apply it to this transducer segment, which we're going to build out of a couple landmarks here. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to do the starting point, and again, I'm just going to leave it, not apply it to a reference point. So you can see that those are all reference points. We didn't have one digitized for like a center of the lab. You could at this point have a digitized point for the center of the handle and apply it there. That's totally fine. Looking back, I could have done that as well. It doesn't matter all that much. It's not like a force plate where you need to have it approximated exactly where it is, because what you'll see is we're actually applying the forces directly to the hand and another segment that we're going to build in via a landmark called right handle. So what we can do is we're just going to make lab origin, click apply. You can see that the little point popped up there. Then we're going to make another one, lab X, and we're going to offset it by 10 centimeters in the X direction, and then we're going to make, close these if they get in the way. We're going to make one more landmark, lab Y, and offset it there. So what that allows us to do then is go into our segments. We haven't built any segments yet of our actual model, but what we can do is start one, and you don't have to actually choose a demo one for this, but we can just type in transducer, and this is going to be a kinematic only segment, so we don't need it actually kinetic. Seems kind of backwards that it's what the forces are being applied to, but it doesn't need to be calibrated because it's not actually being involved in the process. So we're going to create that. We're going to choose our joint center, being lab O, that middle point, and then we're going to choose our joint center here, being lab Y, for the most distal point, and then we're going to have a lateral point, which is lab X. Applying that and building the model, going back to the segment and then clicking on it, we can then go into segment properties, modify the segment coordinate system, and the segment coordinate system for that guy is going to stay as negative X and positive Y. Apply that, build the model. Do not seem to like that. Might need a radius in meters here. And use calibration targets for tracking. There we go. Okay, so now we've got our orientation of our axis system for that transducer segment. And yeah, when in doubt, if it doesn't pop up like that, sometimes it's either missing this radius in meters or tracking targets. So boom, we've got our transducer segment now, which the forces can be applied to. Okay, so I'm back here building the model. We've got that transducer segment, which I just built, and now we're going to move on and start building our upper arms, forearms, and hands, and then doing the orientation of the of the axis systems for those. So I'm going to start by bringing up, let's start with right upper arm. And we're going to create that using our Visual3D 6 degrees of freedom algorithm because it is going to be a kinetic segment. So I can click create there. I'm going to use the joint center being the right shoulder, and then picking my lateral point as my humerus lateral epicondyle digitized point, the humerus medial epicondyle as the digitized point. And you can see here that it lights them up in yellow, and that can automatically tell me that I was reading this quick and this says I for imaginary and then L humerus. I obviously shouldn't have picked left, but I could see it right there on the model very quickly before I hit apply, which ones I'm picking. So I'll change that to the lateral and medial epicondyles of the right because obviously that is more appropriate. And we can then come down and I'm going to select those exact same calibration targets for tracking, so I can check that off, and it's not going to be tracked with a different segment's tracking targets. From there I can hit apply. Oh, we don't have a depth. I believe I'll put 0.1 meters. There you go. And there we have our right humerus. Then what we can do is we can go into segment properties, and here you can rotate and scale the graphic. But what I want to do now is I'm just going to double check over here on my other monitor what the appropriate, and this is where you're double checking that Wu et al. Paper. I'm going to double check on my right upper arm, get rid of that, segments. Right upper arm. Come on, segment properties. There you go, coordinate system. And this one, according to ours, if I modify it here, should be, and this takes a little bit of mental rotation, but positive X, positive Y will make it easier for, just so you know. So it has X anterior, Z lateral to the right, and Y superior there, or positive Y superior. And this should coincide with this 2005 Wu et al. Paper where they discuss the axis system for the shoulder. So you can see here it's anchored at the point of the acromion, X anterior, Z to the right, and then Y positive superior. And that's and then it goes through the different ways to interpret that. But that's where the origin should be coincident with the glenohumeral joint, which it is because we originated it at the shoulder joint. So we can come back to our V3D model and see that that lines up to what that paper said there as well. Now this stays the same for our left upper arm as well. So let's make our left upper arm, create that using the exact same sort of sequence of events there. Now I definitely know where my left medial and epicondyle are. Oh, but see, that's from forearm. I want my humerus one. Lateral, medial, use calibration for tracking. 0.1 meters. Apply that. Now you can see that the axis system isn't what it should be. We should have Z out to the right and then X anterior. So we are going to, again, this is where this gets a little crammed up top, but we can go into segment properties for left upper arm, modify coordinate system, and I believe positive X, positive Y is what should line it up. And now those are both the same. Obviously the person's shoulders are rotated in a little bit, so they're sort of towards each other, but those axis systems are coincident exactly with the Wu et al. Recommendations. Okay, so from there we can move on to the forearms. I'll go right forearm first. create that. And the way we've digitized these is with lateral and medial points for both the proximal and distal joints. So there's no joint center. You can create artificial joint centers, but what Visual3D will do is it will create the joint automatically. If the two ends are within a certain distance from each other, it will create that joint. You can create functional joints by having the participant articulate and then using that as a calibration, but we're going to be using our right forearm digitized points here. So the first one being lateral, and then lateral because they're in anatomical position, being the radial styloid of the forearm. Then we'll go ulnar styloid for the forearm, right forearm, ulnar styloid, and then back up to the shoulder, the medial epicondyle from the forearm segment. So all four forearms, I'm going to use calibration targets for tracking, click apply, and there you go. That's your forearm segment there. And the person's hand on this one looks like it's tilted in a bit. They're not in perfect anatomical position with their hands completely supinated out. So that's where you just need to look at your model. And I know that zooming in on here, the tracking targets were placed on the back of their hand. And obviously the back of their hand is lining up, so it's outside those radial and ulnar styloids. So I kind of know that their hands are turned in. They're not in perfect anatomical. That's okay. We can just build the model that way. Obviously, ideally to get yourself oriented, if they're in that perfect anatomical position, it's a little bit better. But we're gonna, again, clicking over here, double check my right forearm. Properties, and it is also positive X, positive Y. So we can go over into our segment properties, modify positive X, positive Y, and then again, it is situated almost identical to the shoulder. Again, the shoulder will change a little bit more than the elbow, but positive out to the right is Z, positive Y is superior or proximal, and then negative Y is distal, and positive X is anterior. So we'll just quickly, again, verify that with the Wu et al. Into the elbow segment here, and you can see the origin, X to the right, Y positive, and X anterior, or sorry, Y superior or proximal. Okay, so from there, we're looking good. We can go on. We're going to build our left forearm segment exactly the same. I'm going to close some of these because I don't need them anymore. Just keeping my workspace a little clean here. Left forearm, create, lateral, lateral, medial, medial epicondyle, lateral, radial styloid, and left forearm ulnar styloid. Using our calibration targets, apply that, and changing our coordinate system to positive X, positive Y to match our other one. So now you can see that because the elbows are both facing in, X is still anterior if the person was in true anatomical position, which they're not, but now X is still positive to the right, so now it's facing posterior because the person's left arm is turned in, so the X, or sorry, the Z is facing back towards them. Y still proximal. Okay, so that looks pretty good. The last ones we're going to do here, going back to our workspace, closing the left arm. So we're going to build our right hand segment, create that, and then we are going to just pull up the right hand, lateral being radial styloid, right hand medial ulnar styloid, lateral being base of the second, and base of the fifth. Okay, we're going to use our calibration targets for tracking there. We've got our coordinate system. Now the wrist is a little bit different, and we'll see here in the Wu et al. Paper that it anchors the coordinate system right there, but you'll notice that they talk about it being a different coordinate system based on if it's the left or the right hand in order to better approximate for radial and ulnar deviation. So they are the same in the same direction. So I'm going to just confirm what that is on Visual 3D here. Just give me a second. So I've got my right hand. We're working on right now. So right is going to stay the same as what we've been building so far. So right, the coordinate system is still going to be positive x, positive y to be in accordance with this. And the hand looks super tiny there, but that's okay. We can scale that after the fact. Again, the representation of the hand is going to look a little bit different, but we can always scale that to make it match. So if we want to scale it here, we can go let's see, 50% probably works for all this. That one made it pretty thick. Okay, that looks a lot better. And again, you can see that this is now on the back of the hand, which I thought it was, and it turns out to be correct based on the way we set it up. So you always want to have a general idea of when you build your model where things are going to appear, and then if they do, then you can verify that. Obviously, they need to be founded in some other paper or previous experience doing this, but once you do it a couple of times, you'll be able to notice when something doesn't pop up in the right area. Okay, so I'm going to hit apply there. And we are doing left hand now. Create that lateral. Where's my left hand? Right here. Base the second, base the fifth there. Okay, we can go into segment properties. Scale that right away because it looks like it's situated with the thumb on the right side and everything. And now when I modify coordinate system, I gotta pay my bills, and come back over. Oh, did it freeze? Come back over to my other model that I was working on. And now we are going to situate this hand being a negative x, negative y. So slightly inverse. And what this will do is, again, I don't know exactly where it is in the Woo It All paper. Talking about XF is directed dorsally, ZF is directed to the right in the anatomical position, ulnarly. Yeah, this is in order to use the same sign convention, so you don't have to mirror them in order to talk about ulnar deviation being the same, because they would be opposite. So now that you flip the axis system, so you can now say, let's say a positive x moment, let's say, is, or positive change in angle about the x is a ulnar deviation, and negative about the x is a radial deviation. So that's why they do it. Again, don't quote me on that those exact rotations are correct, but that's why they explain in the paper that they've done that. Okay, so now that we've got that, at different parts, just to save periodically throughout, you always want to be saving your workspace, and then you can save the model. We can save this model back into where we were working on it in projects, MAS, demo, and then we can save it as our model file. And then that way, if you close this or close the program, you're not going to lose any of the progress you've made. But that's that for now, and we'll get to building the thorax in just a minute. Okay, so now we're going to get on to building the thorax. If you remember sort of earlier in the video, I mentioned that There's a couple of points that we didn't exactly make here and that we're going to need for the thorax. A couple of real points that I probably should have digitized, being C7 and T8. We approximated C7 earlier as 10 centimeters above the midpoint of this rigid body. And then we're not going to necessarily approximate T8, which would be probably another 5 or 10 centimeters below, but what we're going to do is use a digitized point that is the middle of the rigid body to sort of approximate that. And then what we're going to do from there is we're going to find the midpoint between C7 and the suprasternal notch, the midpoint between T8, or that approximated T8 point we're going to be using, and the xiphoid, which are going to create 2 points in the center of the body. And what those will do, that's going to allow the torso to line up nice and straight. If you actually use the shoulders to build the torso model, what that ends up leading to is then if you have one of these points in the center of the body, as it gets closer to that imaginary line, you can imagine that any sort of anterior posterior deviation, if it's very much in line superior inferiorly with the line, the imaginary line between the shoulders, it creates this sort of wild rotation in your thorax segment that can really lead to a lot of change in the angle of the thorax. And if you're using that as a parent segment to reference the angle of, let's say, the upper arm back to the thorax to get shoulder angle, you're going to get wild fluctuations in that we just don't want. So we're going to start by making those points. So I'm going to close down my right and left hand, or sorry, they're landmarks. We're going to start by making those landmarks, and we're going to type those in, and I'm going to start by typing it in as mid C7 suprasternal notch. Was I under functional? Yeah, I was. We don't want a functional one, we just want a regular one. C7 and SSN. And just double checking my process here. Make sure that we start off with our suprasternal notch as our digitized point there. Get my phone out of here, vibrating. And then we are going to project this to an endpoint, so on a line, basically drawing a line exactly between suprasternal and C7, and then projecting it from there 0.5 centimeters downward. Or sorry, putting it 50% of the way actually between the two is what this is doing, because it's offsetting as a percentage between the two and then putting it 50% of the way actually between them. So if we'd apply, we're going to assume that it's going to appear somewhere in here. And that does. Okay, perfect. That's what we want. So that is our new mid C7 SSN point. And now we are going to go back and we are going to create another landmark. Creating this one, this is going to be our mid T8 and xiphoid. They use a different terminology on the tutorial. Again, I am using this thorax modeling tutorial that is available on the C-Motion wiki. So you can see that we are in this rough part here where they're making these mid C7 and suprasternal notch. They have referred to them as slightly differently. I forget what IJ stands for, but it's the deepest part of the suprasternal notch, essentially. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing starting at that mid-rigid body, which we're approximating for our T8. Actually, let's start at xiphoid, just so it's using the exact same convention, starting anteriorly and moving posteriorly. Then our mid-rigid body, we're approximating it, again, using the offset, so it's not a direct 50 centimeters, it's a 50% of the way. We are then applying that, and it appeared 50% of the way between the two. Perfect, so that's exactly what we want there. Then we're going to make one more landmark in order to orient the lateral component of the thorax, just so we don't get a ton of rotation, because now these are both directly almost on a line. So if we have some movement of the rigid body around them, we don't want any sort of axial spin. We are going to call this one thorax X, I believe they call it in the tutorial. And if we go in and we originate this one at our suprasternal notch, we then project it on a line from C7 to that midpoint. So it's in line with C7, starting, yeah, and then starting and ending at this midpoint right there. So you can see that thorax X gets approximated almost out right where suprasternal notch is. I was pretty sure that my thorax X went off to the right hand side before. Oh, it's because we did not do this part yet, which they describe in that tutorial, where you're then approximating the distance between the two. And again, you're leaving this unchecked. I did not check that before, and it created some problems for me. So now our thorax X is situated to the right, and then when we set up the coordinate system, it will move to the right. Again, looking at pictures from the tutorial really helped me. As soon as that one approximated anteriorly near suprasternal notch, it was so close that I knew it was definitely like looked wrong. So you can then obviously go back and forth and verify against the tutorial, making sure that it looks as correct as possible. You'll get some wonky angles later on, but in order to save yourself a headache beforehand, always go back and double check your work and sort of know where it looks right and looks wrong. I guess you can use this video as reference as well. Okay, we're going to hit apply there. Now we are ready to build our regular thorax abdomen segment. So we're going to create this guy, and going back to that tutorial, going to pull up our segments, and we are there in the tutorial. So now, like I said, our joint centers are going to be that mid, one sec, I want to delete this functional one. Why do I have two of these? Close tab. Yeah. Won't let me close this one, which is going to get confusing. That's the one where we start. Let's see if it lets me create. Close? Yeah, there we go. Now I can actually delete this. That's fine. This one is the one we offset. There we go. Now we can delete this guy. Get it out of the way. Yeah, that's the one we want to keep. Okay. So now that we have that, we can go back in. I guess it's still there. If I build model again, we'll have to see which one looks the most right. This is approximating right where that one was, whereas I don't know. Oh, now it's gone. Okay. You can see, obviously, Visual3D has some like little quirks, and you just gotta work through it. Again, just choosing that, seeing if it fit where we thought we expected it versus the other sort of unknown digitized point. Now you can see that once we built the model the second time, the drop-down menu looks like it should. So now we're going to take that midpoint between that rigid body, or what we approximate as T8, and the xiphoid. Now, the lateral component of this is what we are going to use as thorax X. So it's going to select that thorax X point right here as the lateral choice. And what that's going to do is it's going to set up our thorax segment to, again, notice that it will be having sort of like a lateral anchor, so you don't get this rotation about the midpoint. We're going to use our calibration targets for tracking it. We're not going to track it with anything else, but what we are going to need is we're going to need to assign a depth in meters being 0.14 And oh, you know what? Actually, I was wrong. For this one, we are going to track using different targets. We're going to track using C7, xiphoid, suprasternal notch, and T8. So not using those midpoints. We're going to track it using actual sort of regular anatomical landmarks. Suprasternal, T8, and xiphoid. And then we're going to set the radius for each one of these joint centers as 50% of the distance between the shoulders. And this is what we denoted our shoulders as in the landmark segment there. We're going to hit apply, and then you're going to see that the torso segment appears completely flipped. Now, that's totally normal. We're going to hit build model. And don't fret, because if you go into the tutorial here, you can see that it's right side up, and this is where it says scaling it. Again, it mainly is just sort of applying the segment with the little visualization where it thinks it's oriented to, and you can see the orientation here where it has Y positive, X off to the right, and Z, Y anterior and Z facing superior. So let's just check ours to see that it's doing that, and it is. So it's just our graphic that's wrong. So we can then go into segment properties, rotate and scale that graphic, and then right in this, whoop, didn't like that was in the way. Right in this, it basically says rotate the graphic. We want you to rotate it 180 degrees in the vertical rotation, then move it and slightly rotate it that way. So I'm just going to pull this off onto the second monitor so I can follow all that. So again, it says scale. We want rotate, vertical rotation, 180 degrees. We want into scale now. Change the scale for all three to 180. Which looks quite large. Whoop, I got rid of it prematurely there. Oh, no, that's the coordinate system. We know that that's good. And then what we're going to do is it says change, move up, down to 65. I find that this looks a little high for a lot of people, so just play with this as you want to see it sort of fit your model. Ours looks like the lowest it'll go. Again, because ours isn't at T8, ours is a little higher. That's probably one of the reasons why this slides up a little bit. If our true T8 was where it was supposed to be, it would be down here, and then the model would fit. But you can play with it just to approximate it yourself. Again, the actual orientation of it and the coordinate system all look correct here. You can always center it, and that looks pretty darn good to me. But you'll notice if you reference back to the thorax segment in our Wu et al. Paper with ISB conventions, Z being out to the right, X anterior, and Y superior is not originating at the suprasternal notch, is not the actual orientation of what I just described. So what we're going to do is, instead of changing this all and flipping the coordinate system around and then having to scale the graphic all differently, what we're going to do is we're going to build sort of a false or imaginary segment that doesn't have a visual representation, but that is going to be our ISB sort of coordinate oriented thorax segment, and we do all the calculations based on that one. So this one will stay in order to track our thorax. Our ISB one will be based on this, but it will be slightly different. So I'm just going to pause for a second, get myself oriented with that, and then we'll build that one. Okay, so now that we've got our thorax segment built, we're going to move on to building a thorax segment which we can properly reference. Again, I mentioned that this coordinate system doesn't fit the Wu ISB standards. So if we just pull those back up here, the expectation is that we have X protruding anteriorly, Z positive is to the right, and Y is superior, originating at the suprasternal notch. And what you can see is we don't have that. We have them all originating at that midpoint between C7 and suprasternal notch, which we created. That's where the coordinate system sort of naturally originates. That axis system, you can also see that the axis system doesn't line up with the y protruding superiorly, z positive to the right, and x forward. So instead of deleting this, because we've oriented it nicely, it looks like a nice visual representation for us, what we're going to do is we're going to build another second thorax segment which sits on top, that we actually reference that coordinate system. When you're referencing, let's say for angles or moments, you're referencing the upper limb back to the reference of that thorax segment. You're going to be using the ISB one that we're going to make. So in order to do that, we need to start off by making a couple of landmarks here. And again, I'm using that, I'm following this tutorial, and we're going to make a second one that sits over top without a visual representation, and it's going to look like this. So we're following this part of the tutorial on the C-Motion site there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new landmark, and this is going to be called thorax underscore ISB underscore Z. Oh. And what we are going to do is we are going to start that off originating from our suprasternal notch. We are going to use an existing coordinate system for that. So not referencing it to the lab coordinate system anymore, referencing it back to this specific thorax one. And that's why we don't change the axes for this in the tutorial, because if you change the axes, flip them around for that tutorial, what you're going to end up doing is messing it up when you actually go to fill out the other part of this. Then we are going to offset that 0.1 centimeters medial laterally, leaving this unchecked. I left this checked and it was only offsetting a tiny little bit, and it was really messing me up for a while. So applying that, we get this point Z, which offsets from our suprasternal notch. Again, our representation isn't perfectly scaled. Suprasternal notch should obviously sit, this body should either come forward or be a little bit thicker, but that is our digitized point, that's suprasternal notch, so I can be fairly confident that wasn't even approximated, it was actually digitized on the person, so that we're pretty confident in that. And thorax underscore Z, or thorax underscore ISB underscore Z, is going to sit directly lateral to that. We're going to make another landmark that's going to sit superior to that, thorax underscore ISB underscore Y. And we are also going to start that at the suprasternal notch, use an existing coordinate system, which is going to be the thorax coordinate system. And we are going to offset that axially, 0.1. Hitting apply, we should get one directly above suprasternal notch, which we got right there. Again, and it's above, not directly, because if I zoom out, you can see that the lab coordinate system, it should be almost straight up vertically, but because there's a slight lean back where the rigid body is indicating that this thorax segment is lean back, because we're now referenced to this coordinate system, it is following the lean back of the Z there, so a slight tilt off true plumb. Did I get rid of my phone there? All right. Okay, so now now that that's not vibrating, we can move on and come back into our segments here. We're going to make our thorax. Close that off. Underscore ISB segment. We're going to create that using our first joint center as suprasternal notch, our second joint center as thorax ISBY, and our lateral point as thorax ISBZ. We are then moving into segment properties, modifying the coordinate system of that to -x, -y, setting the segment mass as 0.1, changing it to a cone, and saving that. Oh, we need our tracking targets. Yes, we want to save that, but we need our tracking targets as C7, went way past, suprasternal, xiphoid, and our mock T8. So we can build that. Now, again, we haven't seen our coordinate system pop up because we're missing the radius depth there, and it's going to be the same as what our other thorax segment was, that half the distance between the shoulders. So I'm going to copy that, pop back out into our thorax ISB segment, paste that same thing into both, hitting apply. We now get our coordinate system that is true to ISB standards. Again, Z positive to the right, Y positive superior, and X positive anterior. So that is our nice little coordinate system built to ISB standards. So our model is pretty much created. The one thing we're missing here is sort of specific to this experiment, or specific to any instrumented thing, is that you need a place to apply the force to. So I talked about this before when making that transducer segment down here, that's where we're going to import it to and transform it according to that coordinate system, transform the forces. But we actually need a place that is close enough to the skeleton we're actually going to be applying those forces. So you could digitize this in space. We didn't end up doing that. Going forward, I would probably digitize it in space if I had to do this same project again. But what I can do is I can approximate a point on the hand where they were grasping it. So what I did was I just took 75% of the distance from the second, from the midpoint between the second metacarpals there, and just moved it down. So basically moving it down from the joint center of the wrist basically gave me the exact same thing, and it was a little bit easier moving it 75% of the way from the wrist joint to the hand, being sort of a midpoint of the hand. And remember that the axis system are different for the hands, so we're going to have to flip that and make one positive and one negative. So if I go into landmarks here, just looking over to make sure I do this seamlessly and don't necessarily get it all confused, because this is something I did, not according to the tutorial. Okay, so what I did here was I went to landmarks, add a new landmark, underscore handle. Handle, I use the starting point of, oh no, okay, so I didn't use a starting point. I projected it from an existing coordinate system being the right hand, and then offset it axially negative 0.75% of the distance, so 75% of the distance. So now we have a point that is always locked to our mid hand, which we can then apply our forces to. So that's perfect. We're going to do the same thing for the left, just noting that that will have a sign change there. So I'm going to close these up, clean up my space, add a new one, go left, underscore handle, offset according to the left hand, 75% of the distance, hitting apply. We then get that point on the hand there as left handle. So that's perfect. That's pretty much our model built exactly the way we want it, or we're going to need it. From there, I'm going to save the model template, saving it as probably a new version. Don't always necessarily want to overwrite all the old versions of what you do, just in case you need to go back. We're going to save that, and that's the model all built. I'll be bringing in forces in just a second. Okay, I'm actually just going to insert this in here after the fact, but one thing I definitely forgot to say while building our model. So I've got our model all built, and one thing I totally forgot to go in and make sure I changed was the height and weight of our participant. So I'll just pop in my height and weight there in centimeters and kilos. And this is very important before we export to our joint moments because it does affect the calculations. Then you're going to want to hit build model one more time. Once it builds the model, Okay, perfect. I'm then going to just make sure and assign it to all motion files again, and then we can come back out to our workspace, but make sure that you add the height and weights before you export. Okay, so now that we've got our model built here and we're looking good, we are going to move over to the workspace and then click File, Open Add, and we're going to insert our motion files into the workspace. Now that we are ready to go, and we are going to bring all these motion files, all these C3D files in. They are all the trials we're going to be working with. Again, just as a little refresher, we have all our trials here, so we have different hand locations, different exertions with different hands, and different directions for those exertions, all corresponding to different trial numbers. Okay, so now if we open one of these files, you can see that it's got no model applied. Sometimes you can center this, but right now you're just sort of looking at a bunch of dots, almost like when before you built the model. I can kind of see from looking at this that this is a right hand exertion. They've got their right hand raised, their left across their lap. Again, they were doing seated trials, exerting against the transducer. But what we're going to need to do is apply the model to that one segment, so, or to all the motion files. So we can go back to model, go model, assign model to motion files, click the top. I mean, if you want to apply it to all of them, you can do this, but click the top one, click the bottom one while holding shift, and then click the check mark. You can go through and check them all individually as well if you have a very specific subset of them. Click OK, and then when we come back to the motion files, we can now double click on it and we can see that our model has been applied. And you can now play this. You can see that ours obviously has very little movement because the person is simply raising their hand, their left hand in this case, to exert. They're kind of pushing or pulling or doing something we don't necessarily know yet. I would only know what they're doing looking at this trial by going back to my data sheet, knowing that that was trial 2, and knowing that because that's a number 4, that is a pull trial. So that's the only reason we would know that. But we will know that with our reaction force vector in a minute once we import all our forces. So in order to go through and import all our forces, what we're going to do is be selected on a trial here, and then go into our pipeline, and we're going to be making our pipeline. So we're going to open this, and I'm going to start from scratch just so we don't get too confused here. But once you make it once, you can save that and just sort of work off that a bunch of different times. So we're going to be making our pipeline here. Okay, to start making our pipeline, I'm just going to open that to make sure that I'm going step by step here. We're going to first start by ensuring that we are importing data from our ASCII file. So basically opening our ASCII text file and making sure that we select the proper one to be importing those channels. These are the ASCII files or the text files that we converted before using that Convert3D program. So there's a nice little function here, so you can go in and look for the actual function you want, but if you know what it is from a handy tutorial, you can actually search for it. And I know that mine is going to be import analog signals from an ASCII. Where is that? Import data. Come on. Import data from ASCII file. There you go. So we're going to move that over, and basically everything in here, you can change this all you want, and obviously you can program it a bunch of different ways to restart and renumber it. But I'm just going to leave that blank because I want to make sure that I choose them. Again, if I choose the wrong one or code the wrong one, I find that it just crashes the program. So I'm going to make sure I'm going to choose them manually. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start working with some expressions here. So we're going to choose this evaluate expression. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, so the first one we're going to do is we're basically just going to make this scale factor of 1 that will be multiplied and applied to everything that we do, all the signals that we import, because we don't want to scale them by anything differently or have them all wonky. We want to make sure that they were sampled at 500 hertz, just like our signal here, so they stay that way, and all the magnitudes of the signal stay the same. So from here, we can edit this by saying expression equals 1, and then the exclamation mark is the way that these signals are, or this pipeline is commented out. So in order to get that part of the text to work for you, you actually need to delete the little exclamation point there. So we're going to go, signal names are actually going to be left blank, result type, this is going to say metric, result folder processed, result name is scale. Okay, that's good there. We're then going to go back and add another evaluate expression, and now that we've got our scale metric built, I'm actually going to stop this from just running in the background. This is the one where we're going to want to actually create the expression where we import our signals into into the program and to calculate the vector, which will be represented as the ground reaction force vector in the program. So clicking on this, our expression is going to be vector, then opening a bracket, analog, bringing in our first analog signal because they're represented as analog in the ASCII file, double colon, and then original, because as we import them they'll be under this original folder, double colon, and then we named them channel 1. So this is important that this is the same signal or channel that you name it in the ASCII file. If this channel is named something different, it will crash. If you bring in the wrong file with the wrong parent, it will crash. So make sure that you write this appropriately. This you only have to do once. The choosing of the file names is sort of a tedious back and forth, just making sure you do it right. But if you don't change your naming conventions in your conversion, this is totally fine. And this is why I just named it channel 1, because for different experiments we can then leave it, just name channel 1, 2, 3, 4, and use the same conversion template in Convert3D. Whereas if we name this force axial or something like that, if we changed it or moved the load cell, then it would be sort of non-intuitive, or we'd have to go in and change the pipeline and rename this channel. So moving on from there, we can then do the same thing with our other two channels, basically adding a space and making it identical, but bringing in channel 2, adding a space, identical, bringing in channel 3, deleting my comma there, and then that is going to be, make my window a little bit bigger. You're going to close brackets and then multiply that by the metric you created earlier. So asterisk for multiplication, metric, and then your metric is going to be housed in the folder we made earlier for it. So it's going to be housed in metric, processed, and scale. Quickly making sure I think I typed everything correctly. If I didn't, we're going to find out in a second. Signal names here. I'm going to name this force. I think I added a space there. Result type is going to be derived. Result folders are going to be processed because it's not under the same one as the metric, and I can leave it at that because we don't need a result name. Okay, then what we're going to do is take that vector, which we just brought in from our raw channels, and we are going to transform it to the coordinate system of the transducer segment, which I talked about before. So we're going to search for our little transform function. I believe it's in here. Excuse me. Okay, opening that, what we're going to then do is change a bunch of these. Signal type is derived, and we're using where the signal came from and where we just put that one where we calculate the vector. Signal folder. I have signal names above it here, so I don't think it needs to be above it, but I'm gonna do that. Delete that. Signal name, so we named that one force, and it was in processed. Folder was not an original. It was in processed, and now we are taking it and we're taking it from the transducer segment and transforming it to the lab coordinate system and result type, and then we're going to get a new result. Where's my slash? Result type. Derived. Result folders. It's going to be processed again. And result name, what we're going to do is not name it. We're just going to append a suffix to that name of lab. So that should work. That looks a little different because I pasted it, but yeah, I don't think we need this. We're just going to append a suffix to that. Yeah, that worked. Okay, that looks good. And then the last thing we're going to do is create our free moment. So we need to do one more evaluate expression, basically creating our free moment value, which will be 0. Edit that, and in expression we are going 0 multiplied by derived processed, and then our our transformed signal from all three channels, force underscore lab multiplied by 0, and that looks good. Result name free moment, and I'm gonna pop this up top. Then result type derived and folder processed. So we can just comment those out. Clicking OK, that looks pretty good. And now what we can do is save that pipeline and go into our folder that we were working on here. MAS study demo, and I like to save it just right in the one where I had all the files, not in the raw data files. So this is our force port pipeline. Saving that. Okay, be careful here because me clicking execute and I don't know what file I'm on. If I choose the wrong one, again, it'll crash. So always sort of pop out, verify which one you're on. I know I'm on 2 here. So now that it's open on 2, again, I know that in the 2 here, if I were to open this, it's got C3D, the name of the file, 002 listed as the parent. So that'll work for me. If I click on that, click enter, scroll down, you can see that we got our results here. Oh, it says free moment was not derived because there were no results. Okay, so after a quick lab social and then running the code, obviously before that, and seeing that it didn't work, pop back into it, just checked it. Obviously this right here, I'll zoom in on that so you can see it, is spelled wrong. So go back and double check if you do it. If you do it live, it's not always necessarily going to work out. I had an extra V in there. Now if I hit execute, and I'm going to choose my second trial, I can scroll down and I can see that this time everything ran through and processed fully. So we have all our signals, and now if we you can get rid of that for a second. You can leave that up when you're running multiple of them. I'll show you a quick way to go through it if you have different ones and you don't code it into the pipeline because they're all named something different and you want to select them manually. But here you can see we have our derived process signal, our forces that we brought in for each of the channels, and then force lab would apply them, just oriented now transformed to the lab coordinate system, and then our free moment being 0. So from there you can either do it one of two ways. You can either import it like I just did and then apply them directly to the model, or consecutively import them all. I'll do one fully. I'll go back into this trial so we know here that we can still see our forces, and you can double check and see here we don't see force derived. If you want to be super diligent about it, you could name this force underscore lab 002, just so when you're double checking the first couple times you do it, it would make sense that you can double check your work and know that you're not applying forces from a different trial. But like I said, if you've converted your text files appropriately, then it'll actually crash Visual3D if you don't bring them in with the appropriate parent file. So that to me is confidence enough. I don't have to go in and change the code every time, and you'll see that not changing the code, you can actually like import these and run them pretty quickly. But what we're going to do here is I'll apply the model, or I'll apply the forces to the model. So you go model, edit force assignments to segments, and then up here, I always like to play it just so I can sort of see what's going on, especially if you've got multiple different trials, whether it's right, left. So that one's obviously a left hand. Sometimes when it's at umbilicus, I'll just pull up my data collection sheet and just double check what the trial is, because you don't want to be applying something to the right hand when it's a left hand trial. But you go add segment assignment here. We're going to change this from force because our force isn't under that folder, it's under derived, and then we're going to change this to force underscore lab, so our transform vector there. Where the center of pressure is then applied is we're going to apply it to a landmark, and remember we made those handle landmarks, left handle and right handle, so that's that middle green point there, that landmark in the approximated to the sort of the left palm. And then free moment again is not going to be in that folder, it's going to be in derived and free moment because that's how we imported it. And then you can automatically assign this to the appropriate frames, and so it'll pick out where you have the actual signal and not baseline, and then apply it to the closest segment. But for us, it'll always apply to the thorax because our transducer segment is down here. Like I said, if you digitized it in space, which I probably would do next time, it will pick the closest and most appropriate one. But for our case, I'm just going to do it manually to make sure that we're applying it to the appropriate segment. And instead of going in and taking a look at exactly where we have signal and where we don't, I'm just going to apply it the whole way through, because when we watch it, we can see that the force vector actually corresponds really well to when they're exerting. So I click OK and click OK again, save those changes, and now you can see I have this this vector pop up, and this is a pull trial. We double checked that before, so it's quite large. I'll zoom out a little bit. So it's a ground reaction force vector, remember? So, or a reaction force vector because it's mounted on the wall. So because the person's pulling, the arrow is coming out front. So the reaction force of how large of a magnitude of force you have to get for the transducer to not rip off the wall. Okay, so that is that. I'll give you another view of that from the top. And if you're doing this the first couple of times, just double check, make sure it is applying in the right direction and the reaction force vector is indeed going the way you thought. So that looks pretty good. I'm happy with that trial. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go through and I'll apply the forces. I'll show you how I can do that pretty quickly. So we've got our pipeline back up here. I don't have to reload it because if you just click it, it'll work out. I'm going to switch that. And so, okay, so something else I found, if you don't go into the first trial and actually into the signals events pane when you run it, it actually won't run or sometimes crash. But then subsequently you don't have to go into the second and third ones. You can then stay in this view, which again, like I said, if you pick the wrong one, if you go into 3, you can't see anywhere here that it's trial 3 anymore. You then go execute. Someone says something to you, you look away and you go, oof, which one am I on? And you haven't saved your workspace, you're now in trouble, because if you make the wrong choice, it's crashing. So I know that I'm on 3 here, so I can hit OK, and then we'll come back out here. I'll save the workspace. It doesn't like that. I'm going to save the workspace here, and I'll give you a demo of if I load the second one into the third one here. So if I go execute, and let's say, yeah, I pick what were we on here? See, now I'm forgetting for a second. I believe I selected the third one, but let's load the second. Interesting. That did not crash. All right, maybe our code, the way we wrote it, is slightly different and it works, but like I said, you'd probably just want to make sure that you're applying the appropriate forces then even more diligently. Yeah, you can double check in here too, which one you brought it into. You brought it into 3. Okay, so that looks good. Now I'm going to go through and just change that to 4, and then immediately find 4, enter, enter, 6, 6, enter, enter, and then you can go through it pretty quickly that way. 7, enter, enter, 9, and then from there, so you would go through all those, and then obviously once you're done with that, you're gonna have to go in and each trial, let it play. It's not gonna have, it has the forces in here, you can see them, but it does not have the force assigned. So for all our left-handed ones, we are going to go derived moment, apply that to the left hand from 1 to 500, come up here to landmark, apply that to the left handle, derived free moment, okay, yes, and then you have your vector. So I'm assuming that that one is a push, and which one were we looking at here? We were looking at 3. We can quickly verify that 3 was a push, and it was indeed a push, 3 being push. So that's exactly how you do that. You'll then run through all of those, and from there I'll just sort of again cut and paste this, and I'll pick this up once I've done all of those, and then from there what we can do is I'll show you how to export them and a little MATLAB code I made to process something like this. Okay, so I've gone through, and you can see that we now have our forces in every trial, and if I play them, we're going to have trials which have our reaction vectors and forces properly applied to each hand that is active. So a right hand trial there, a left hand one before, another right here, a pull, going through all our data here. There you go, a left hand rightwards exertion. Take a second to think about all of them and make sure that they're all looking good. So from there, what we're going to do is, in order to export all these appropriately, I'm going to select all files here, and then we're going to build our export pipeline. So in order to get going, I'm going to build this from scratch, but I'm just going to, again, making sure I'm doing it right and not spell anything wrong this time. We're going to start with a part of it, the pipeline, which select all file, or select active files, and our active files are going to be all files. So it's going to run through and it's going to apply this pipeline and export everything we're talking about for every single one of these trials. And again, you can code it such that it only selects a few or the ones that you pick out, but I'm going to have it select all files because they're all doing what I want them to do right now, and I'm good with that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is have it interpolate some of the data just such that it is filling a gap of any blanks for us with a cubic spline of about 20 data points. So 0.02 seconds. Yeah, sample data, 100 hertz ish. Yeah. All right. Okay, so then we've got interpolate, and now basically everything from there is going to be done by this function called compute model based data. So I'm going to add one here, and then I'm actually going to add a whole bunch more, and you'll see why that is, because this is a very versatile part of the pipeline where you basically pick or type the data name, so what data you want to export, if it's based on the model, what folder it's from, and then basically all the reference points around it. So the first thing I actually want to export is our ground reaction force data. As my phone slips off my lap there. And so I want to export the raw data because I want to be picking out certain points in my code and at the peak force. So I want to look at the absolute max force that that person is exerting, what are the joint moments and joint angles at that peak force. So in order to do that, part of my code has to have the raw forces input into it. So from there, I'm going to select folder original because it's the GRF data. I'm going to select GRF data there. I'm going to leave normalization off, and then the segment, it's going to come from the transducer, and then the resolution coordinate system is also going to be the transducer, not the lab one. So that will allow me to keep it correct in my head because of the way we imported it. And then it would look like it did in the lab, so I can then rationalize it and sort of pull it up and visualize it like I did here in the notes. All right, so clicking OK there, that's our first one. Now from there, what I want to look at is shoulder moments and shoulder angle, elbow moments and elbow angle, wrist moments and wrist angle for both the right arm and then the left arm. So what we're going to do is insert one of these, so this can only calculate one of those per time. So what we're going to do is insert one for shoulder angle, or sorry, shoulder moment, shoulder angle, right, and then right elbow moment, right elbow angle, right wrist moment, right wrist angle, left shoulder moment, left shoulder angle, left elbow moment, left elbow angle, left wrist moment, left wrist angle. So that's going to be all the ones we're going to need there. And this will be fairly tedious, so I won't necessarily go through, but I'll show you all of them, or not show you all of them, but I'll make sure that I show you enough that it all makes sense. So you're going to type in, so I think I had ours, and I'm going to make sure I type this the same because I'm definitely not rewriting my code, so I want to make sure that this all fits and there's no typos. So right shoulder underscore moment. It's going to be the original folder, and then we are going to pull that. It is going to be a joint moment function. So this is the computational part, not normalized. The segment will be our, where's our right shoulder? Is it RAR? Yeah. Yeah. And our resolute coordinate system is going to be our thorax coordinate system. Oh, this is like, yeah, right upper arm. Okay, and then we're going to resolve it to the thorax. Oh no, we're going to resolve it to thorax ISB in order to make sure that our ISB coordinate segments work out. Okay, so quickly I just figured out why that little error popped up. If you type in the data name before choosing the model-based properties or the calculation, it doesn't like it. It sort of resets that. So if you choose this, fill these out, and then fill that in, then you should be good to go. So the next thing we are going to do is go into model-based data. I started one here. So we are going to do our right shoulder angle. I'm just going to, again, verify exactly what we're going to have here because we want it selected like that, right shoulder angle, from that drop-down list, joint angle, and you'll see it resets the name if I do it that way. So I'm going to retype that, again, without misspelling, and we are going to reference the right upper arm to our thorax ISB segment, and following the Wu et al. Paper, the Cardan sequence for a shoulder is YXY. Click done. Then we will go on to our right elbow moment. Again, here, selecting joint moment. I'll come over here and then I'll type in our, come on, our elbow, good, moment like that, just original, segment being the right elbow, the resolute coordinate system being the one previous to it, so the right upper arm, not using a Cardan sequence and not normalizing. Clicking OK, I selected original there, okay, just double checking that, and then I go on to our, whoop, not helical angle, we want joint angle. This is our right elbow. Just making sure I do it in the proper case. Angle, original folder, and then we are referencing the angle of the right forearm to the right upper arm, and we are using a ZXY. So the Cardan sequence is the sequence by which it flips or orients the rigid body coordinate system to resolve to the digitized points from the above segment. So you can read more about this, but essentially the order in which you flip something matters because the end position can be completely different. If you flip it 60, 60, and 40 degrees about the different axes, the order in which you do that has an end result of a different orientation. So in order to appropriately flip it and match it to the more proximal coordinate system, you have to choose the proper Cardan sequence. That is also listed in that Wu et al. Paper 2005 for the upper body. So from there, you can see that that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to run through and do the rest of the right arm here, just so you know what the Cardan sequences are. We are going to do right wrist moment here, and then left is going to be the same. So we want joint moment, right wrist, clicking original, not normalizing. We want the, oh, not the left wrist, we want the right wrist with the resolute coordinate system of the right forearm. Done. Again, not using a Cardan sequence for the joint moments because those are calculated already in the model. And then the angles. We want a joint angle here. Right wrist angle original right hand to right forearm, and a ZXY for this one as well. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to run through. I'll do the same thing for the left hand here, and then what we'll do is we'll create our final MATLAB export. Okay, so now the final thing we are going to do is we're going to export all these calculated data or signals to our mat file. Where's MATLAB? There we go. Export data to mat file. This way they'll all be housed in their own structures or arrays depending on the type of data you have into MATLAB, and it just makes it a little bit easier to process rather than bringing it into an ASCII, having to then parse out your data column by column, rename it as a variable, and then move on from there. This way it's embedded in like a cell array embedded in another cell array or something that you can then index into. It's just a little bit easier, I find. Okay, so if we go export to mat file, we double click that or click edit, it brings up this little box here. We're going to browse and select where we want that exported to. So again, I was working in this demo folder, so I'm just going to say SO4 moments output. Okay, save that. So now you have where that's going to, and then here one by one you're going to essentially go through the variable names that you want. If I just pull this up, I have a couple that I created. So we're going to do force. You're going to choose the signal parameter from this long list of everything that's been calculated. So one of the things that you're going to notice here is some of the ones that you computed over there don't actually exist yet. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click done here, save this. I'm going to execute the pipeline once. So it runs through, calculates everything we told it to calculate, but then it didn't save to any of the MATLAB stuff because I didn't specify that yet, which is totally fine. But now when we come into the export data to mat file and I want to add some data, I can then choose the signal parameter that I'm looking for. So here I'm looking for my, as a motorcycle goes by my apartment, I'm looking for my derived force. So then we talked about that reaction force that I then want to bring in so I can index into and find the peak force or find the moments at the peak force. So whoop, exit out of that. Okay, force, signal parameter, I'm going to go in, derived force, not force underscore lab. I'm going to add that, then we're going to do our force lab vector. We're going to add that force lab vector, not hitting done, hitting add. Then we're going to add time, just so we have a running clock of everything we've done here. And where is time? I believe these are not alphabetical. Time would make me think it would be near the top. Oh, I believe I did. I selected frame numbers and then named that time. Okay, so we're going to add that. Then moving on, we're going to then be able to start selecting our moments. So our computed data here, our link model base is the reason we ran that pipeline to start. So we are then going to say our right shoulder moment right there, and I believe I just named it. This little part, and added that, and then you just basically go through it like that, then choosing the next one, which is right shoulder angle, and then how did I name this? Oh, I went through and changed this to angle, and add data. So essentially you're going to run through all of that just like that, and then you are going to get something like this. So just replace that pipeline, open it with this one, and then we are going to have one where I ran through and I've already inputted all of them. So again, those are pretty straightforward. You're just choosing them from a list, naming them to the MATLAB variable you want. There's no specific card in sequence, so I didn't need to show you every single step by step. And this is where I slipped up, because I actually exported the signal type of frame numbers under two different things, frame numbers and time. So I don't actually end up using time, I believe, in the code. I do end up using frame numbers. So that's that, and then we hit execute and scroll down the bottom and make sure we didn't get an error. And then we can also check our folder for our map file, and then down here, that's our code. Where'd our map file go? Okay, so sometimes it doesn't enjoy saving that map file. Oh wait, it's because I had opened the new one and didn't have it referencing back to our original folder. So again, if you're running it on multiple participants and you have the same export code, but you're running it for, let's say you just ran it for participant 3, make sure you change the folder directory to reflect participant 4, and then that should be good there. If we execute that, no errors, come back to demo here, scroll to our bottom, and there is our map file there. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'll go through the MATLAB processing in a little bit. Okay, so now we're on to actually processing our data, and what I'm going to do here is just note that in the same folder we had everything, all our pipelines, all our converted text files, and all our C3D files, all our motion files, as well as our workspace, and our details file. Remember the one I kept referencing with the trial details? That'll be important later. But the two that we're going to note now are the MATLAB script here and the MATLAB map file that we just outputted via our pipeline from Visual3D. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to double click and open our script using 2017 MATLAB, but I don't think I use any particular functions that wouldn't be good on 2016. But I'll just go through and tell you roughly how this script works and how I organize the data. So I'll bring this over, and you can see here that I started and start a timer and set the participant number, but I'll pause it right here so we can load the map file and see everything that's contained in the map file just as it was exported from Visual3D. Okay, so when I run that, you can see that we have our shoulder moment, shoulder angle, wrist moment, wrist angle, elbow moment, elbow angle for the right as well as for the left. We have our frame rate being 100 hertz, and then we have our frame numbers, and then the raw outputs of the force and force vector. So from there, let's take a look at what we've got here in our shoulder moments, opening up our cell array of doubles inside a cell array. So 36, because we had 36 trials. Again, using that trial detail sheet, we can know which one is which. But if we double click on one of the doubles, you can see that in there we have our 3 axes, X, Y, and Z accordingly, and we have data for 500 points because that's how long each one was. So we have each one of our trials embedded within this 36 by 1 cell array. And that's sort of how I have the data set up. Basically what I do is I import those, I then import that trial details sheet so we can then know which trials are which, then denoting which ones are right hand, left hand, so we can appropriately index into the right arm or left arm data. I then set a counter and determine what the length is, so this being 36, so how many times we have to run through the loop, populating our output table. Then here we retrieve the trial numbers, just verifying that the trial number from the C3D file name is indeed the trial number from our trial data sheet, just to prevent any errors where we've listed a different trial number in the data sheet versus what it actually is listed as in the C3D output. So just a little bit of sort of error checking there. I downsample the force because the raw force, remember we brought it in and we have to downsample it. It's sampled at, I believe, 200 hertz. Yeah, excuse me. So there's 1,000 data points, and what that means is that we have to downsample it because we had those 50 points before and after. So I downsample the force. I then populate a table with all our appropriate output variables, a bunch of them being the trial number, position, hand from that data sheet, and then populate those in right after that. But then I also set the variable names for what we are eventually going to have as our right shoulder moment, right shoulder angle. And again, we have our whole list of 500 data points, but what we're looking for is the moments and angles at the instance of absolute peak force. So in order to do that, what we need to do is I convert these a little bit just so we have a little bit of a move from the raw variables, so we're not overwriting the raw. And again, I'm not a master coder by any means, so I know I've worked in a little bit of redundancy to give myself sort of a teaching aspect to this as well. But hopefully if you're reading this code, it's commented out enough and you can understand that I did that to not overwrite my variables, so then I can know at any point if I mess up and I don't like what the output for left elbow moment is, or left elbow moment is giving me an error, I'm confident that I can go back and look at left elbow underscore moment, and that is my raw data because it's never actually been touched or overwritten. I then create a couple cell arrays of blanks to make sure that if there's actually no data in a certain one, because you can see here this is likely, as this is right shoulder moment, these are likely left-handed trials, and then here we have a trial that doesn't have any data. Basically inserting double of all zeros makes it so that that doesn't actually break the loop, so it will supplement data, but it'll just be zeros. Then what I do is I go in and I find either the max or min based on the direction. So if it is an up direction, it's going to be a min, and if it's a down, it's going to be the max, just because of the way the load cell was oriented. Again, if down being positive x, but up is negative. And if it's an up trial, I want to choose the largest negative value. So that's why I did it that way. At each time, I'm also finding the index point on which that max or min occurs, and then down here we then use that index point to go in and pull our appropriate limb moments at the shoulder, elbow, and wrist, and then the angles at the shoulder, elbow, and wrist. And you can see that, again, I wanted some redundancy in here to make sure I didn't get, well, I could have coded it so that I didn't code in hand here and I only did direction, and then it would give me data for the left hand. It would likely be garbage and I'd have to know to ignore that later, but you can see that if I take the stop off, run the whole program, and we look at our output data sheet here, you'll see that the way I did it was so that we actually have zeros, so when the person is reading, they don't necessarily get confused. You can see that this 6 trial it was actually a right-handed trial, but it just was, it was a left-handed trial, but it had bad data, so it ends up being NANs. But you can see that for the ones that are these, again, this being hand, this being left hand, all our right hand values are zeros. Instead of being small numbers that we're just supposed to know to ignore, they'll be zeros, so that I found that kind of nice. But basically, going through, we have our shoulder moments and shoulder angles at the very time point in which the peak force for that direction occurred. So that's how I set that up. I'll post this code in a little GitHub link if anyone, and put in the comments or something if anyone wants to take a look at it. Hopefully it helps you learn. I know that I just spent a lot of time, as this was sort of my first code, tackling something like this, just going back and forth in the MATLAB trial and answer section. So then obviously if we want to comment that out, we can have it not write to table, but if I want to run the whole thing again and have it actually write to a output table, this is what we did to get Excel or text files that we then combined at a later date. So if I then go in and open this Excel file, I can see that in our demo folder, it's now populated this Excel file. That'll open in MATLAB, so let me open it in Excel. We now have our nice data output sheet. You can copy and paste these, and what we did was we just basically took all our participants, so this participant 4, and then we collated all those together. So then we have all our data together, and we can basically work those into nice pivot tables and get our stats output. You can see here that I have some blanks. What I did there was I just made it sure that if there was data that didn't actually coincide with a direct peak, because there was some blackout, but there is data available on either side. We then went in, manually watched the trial, determined where the force vector was. If it was outside a range where we felt comfortable, then we wouldn't sample that and just leave that blank, not include that in our stats. But if it was, let's say, 1 or 2 or 30 data points off, but the force vector was very, very close to what its peak was, we would then fill that data as it was a fairly static trial, and we're confident that those angles and moments hadn't really changed as long as the force is similar. Again, if you had a more dynamic trial doing something like this, you would just want to leave those blank completely, but that's how we did that. So hope that was helpful, and will allow anybody to then do some upper body moment analysis. Again, things I would probably change is digitizing in the transducer right away to start, and maybe trying to work with a little bit different file naming conventions so you could create an easier pipeline that would just rip through all your data and import it all at once. But that's that. Hope that video was helpful, and have a good one.